Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I covered the first part of the Second Battle of Deep Bottom. Now I'll move right into the major fighting that occurred during the engagement near Fusil's Mill. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The sky was cloudless, the sun had a full head of steam on. Not a breath of air was astir in the dense woodlands through which the infantry brigade marched and countermarched, and water was not to be had except at the slow-flowing wells of the few denizens of the section. Alfred Terry's division of David Birney's 10th Corps stood in the oppressive heat since 3 a.m., ready for their assault on August 16th. It was around 6 a.m. when they stepped off to attack the Confederate position, but they soon ran into a problem. Fusil's Mill Pond blocked their way. Although the 2nd Corps had encountered it a couple days before, that information wasn't passed on to the 10th Corps. So Terry pulled his brigade back and reorganized them for another assault, and this time they would avoid the mill pond. They pushed off again for the second time, but came to a deep ravine and encountered stiff resistance. Terry pulled back and sent word to Birney, telling him of the infantry in his front. Birney told him to go forward anyway. Terry reorganized his division for the third attempt and attacked again. The ravine gave his men a lot of trouble, but the depth of the ravine and the forest shielded them from the enemy bullets. Charles Field, the Confederate division commander in that sector, sat in a field with his staff behind Ambrose Wright's brigade. His nephew and adjutant general stood up and said, "General, they are breaking." Field replied, "Well, I knew they would." His nephew clarified, "But General, it's our men." Field stood up and witnessed his line split in half, with Terry's men plunging through the gap made in the Confederate line. Robert E. Lee was near the situation as well. He could hear the attack and the chaotic sounds coming from the front. He rode forward, saw the men running, and tried to rally them. He yelled, "My friends, rally, and go back and help your fellow soldiers. Drive these people back. We must drive them back and retake those works." Many of the soldiers didn't heed his call, and Lee's staffers worked tirelessly to reorganize the soldiers. In the meantime, the Federals were gaining ground. Pond's brigade was the main unit to break through. Foster's brigade only partially got through the enemy works. The left side of the brigade remained outside the enemy's former line. One Union soldier described the scene. It was almost like the rising of a stage curtain. The rebels were being taken prisoners by the first line, its attack having been too furious to permit a retreat. Between the edge of the woods and their works, the ground was rising, very marshy and well filled with fallen trees and other obstructions. Over all these we clambered, and hastening up the declivity, entered the works and joined the first line in loud huzzas at the victory. Terry took Hawley's brigade and tried to expand the breakthrough, but the Georgians from George Anderson's brigade on the Confederate right came up about that time and halted Hawley's advance. In another effort, Terry ordered Calvin Craig's brigade, detached from the 2nd Corps, to continue the attack. They rolled up the Confederates on the Union left, but were eventually halted, just like Hawley's men. It now became somewhat of a standoff as the Union soldiers couldn't go any further, but refused to give up their ground. A detachment from Evander Law's old brigade, commanded by William F. Perry, went forward, consisting of the 15th and 48th Alabama. This detachment was commanded by William C. Oates of the 15th. Oates attacked the left of Craig's line, partially driving it back, but the Alabamians couldn't maintain the momentum, and it devolved into another stalemate. Craig, in the fight with the Alabamians, received a mortal wound to the head. His replacement would be Colonel John Pulford of the 5th Michigan. This Detroit lawyer had already received 5 wounds. A cannonball fractured his skull, jaw, and collarbone at Malvern Hill. He was wounded at Chancellorsville once, and wounded twice at Gettysburg, and received a broken back at the Wilderness that partially disabled his arms. More Confederate units descended on the bulge in the Confederate line. As the 5th South Carolina marched toward the scene, their 2-mile journey at the double quick had their tongues hanging out of their mouths like hounds, as their commander described. The commander of the regiment saw General Lee and wanted the commanding general to see his men in the best light, so he ordered, "5th Regiment, right dress." Lee responded, "No time for right dress, Colonel. Charge 'em, boys," with a hearty shout. As the Confederate reinforcements increased, Union troops and the breakthrough decreased. Rebel bullets reduced the number of Federals, but so did the sun. Both Hawley and Pond went down with sunstroke. Terry repeatedly sent word to Birney for reinforcements through couriers. but he finally went personally to Birney to ask for those reinforcements. By this point, most of the Union troops were in the former entrenchments of the rebels, having been pushed back by mounting pressure and running out of ammunition. Nevertheless, Birney sent William Cowan and Francis Osborne's brigades forward. When they got to the abandoned Confederate entrenchments, they stopped to catch their breath. Then Osborne's men advanced into the open field. A deadly crossfire ripped into the brigade. It lost multiple commanders, and by the time it essentially disintegrated, it was led by a captain. Robert E. Lee was still near the front as the fighting continued. General Lee busied himself in rallying and reassuring the troops who had been driven back. To some he used words of gentlest kindness, praising them for what they had accomplished. Others he sternly upbraided and ordered them back into the fight. His presence and words seemed to work magical influence on both classes. Lee ordered a surgeon to examine each man that passed to make sure they were indeed hurt before allowing them to pass to the rear. The Confederate regiments attacked the Union position, would be thrown back, and another would charge forward. During one of these lulls in between attacks, a Union chaplain brought the Federal soldiers a watermelon. It was speedily cut up and divided, General Foster very glad to get his share. What could have been more refreshing under fire? Before it was finished, orders were given for our regiment to swing around, fronting to the left and covering the flank, on which an attack was momentarily expected. It was comical enough to see officers forming their men, enforcing their orders with brandished slices of melon, and taking a bite between each command. A concerted effort on the part of the rebels saw them dislodge the Union troops from their position. One Union soldier remembered, "I have seldom been so close to the enemy before. Our corps was flanked on the left completely and driven back. Union and rebel colors waved from the same parapet. The flag of a Virginia regiment and the flag, tattered and torn, of the 97th Pennsylvania Volunteers were planted not 6 feet apart. That was hot work, but we brought the flag off in safety." The Federals were thrown out of the entrenchments, and many prisoners were taken. The blue captives marched by Lee, and as they did, one Union private yelled to Lee that a Confederate private had stolen his hat, a death sentence in that heat. Lee asked for him to point out the Southerner who took it. He did, and Lee had the hat returned. The next day, Winfield Scott Hancock, the commander of the Union expedition, asked for a truce to collect the wounded and dead between the lines. It was granted, but the Confederates had already cleaned up the battlefield, signaling that they commanded the sector and essentially letting Hancock know he was defeated. They did exchange their dead, however. One Union soldier remembered, "We met the rebels halfway between the lines. I saw thousands of them swarming their works, and scores came to meet us, bringing on stretchers the ghastly, horrible, mutilated dead whom we had lost in the charge of the day previous. The sight and smell would have made you wild, but we are used to it." Over the next couple of days, some heavy skirmishing occurred, but it mostly consisted of the two sides looking at one another, and at one point, a lull lasted so long that soldiers on opposing sides met between the lines to exchange coffee, tobacco, and newspapers. Grant finally called off the expedition, and Hancock would pull his troops back across the James River, but not for a rest. Grant had another idea in mind. The Deep Bottom expedition, he hoped, would pull troops away from Petersburg so he could strike at the Weldon Railroad. It had worked, but with Hancock leaving, Lee was pulling troops back to Petersburg. After the major fighting on the 16th, some of Hancock's troops were dispatched across the James to assist the 5th Corps in their attempt to sever that railroad. When the 2nd Corps made it to Petersburg, the days of hard campaigning wore down the troops so much that they had barely had the energy to perform simple duties. One soldier remembered, "On the arrival of the regiment in camp, it was sent on picket. Dirty, sore of foot, and stiff in body, we crawled in the picket line. So very warm had it been during the week of active service that the varnish fried out from the butt of my pistol at my back, and it was painful to touch the surface of my rubber blanket with my neck, and so pressed was my underclothing that in removing it, the skin and spots came with it." At the Second Battle of Deep Bottom, the Union lost 2,901 soldiers, and the Confederacy lost less than half that number, with 1,250. Most of the Union casualties came from the 10th Corps, losing 1,678.